there may be no impact on the outcome, as in the design. Because if you're a good urban designer or a good mixed-use developer or whatever, you might have been going to produce that anyway. That is possible. But the likelihood is that the intelligence that local people bring, whether it's about key routes or about flooding or about whatever it is that they feed in, will make it a more resilient scheme. If it's a development, or it could be a landscape or open space, whatever it is. But the issue is it will have greater ownership, that the affinity with it, so that this people-place connection will be stronger. It won't feel it's been imposed by an external developer or an external agency or whatever it is. So that's the connection that has resonance in longer term in terms of the sense of ownership. But it may not in terms of the actual scheme. But usually it will have an impact on the margins. So on some of the canal ones, the positioning of the bridge changed as a result of, the canal people decided they would like a bridge, they thought we probably needed it, but the intelligence of the people round about in terms of where they needed it, and that strength of that bridge gave access to a new local health centre to a whole part of the community that probably wouldn't have used it, wouldn't have access. So that kind of thing, now if you think about that, that then makes an impact on the quality of people's lives. It's not about the bridge, it's about the access to the health centre and the shops and things like that. So the cumulative effect of these small things can have a big impact on whether they even bother to walk to the health centre or things like that. But I think you're right, more research on some of those marginal things. I mean, some of the things that Jan Gale's office have been tracking over time suggests and alludes to that. And a lot of it is creating environments that people feel safe and comfortable going out into anyway, of all ages. It's not just a narrow age band. But I think there's more scope. I know those in the room interested in research, there's more scope to look at that more closely. What we sometimes forget, that Jane Jacobs was writing against planning and urban design interventions, often by people like Moses and the big urban regeneration and motorway schemes in the 40s and 50s and 60s. So the answer is yes. The issue is that we have to translate that kind of question and thinking to our own situations, and sometimes we're dealing with towns or villages or neighbourhoods. So we don't just copy her, but that quality of life thinking is absolutely pivotal. And I was lucky to work with a guy who is a kind of disciple of that guy called Francis Tibbles, who wrote his own book, Making People-Friendly Towns, and lots of us have worked with others, like I've worked with Jan Gale's office and so on. That strand of thinking, but we also have to question it. Don't just accept it as gospel, use it, because that's what Jane Jacobs and others were doing. She was questioning what was happening and why. And I would say that the biggest thing for me that I got when she said a neighbourhood works when there are people that we don't know in it, but we feel totally comfortable. So we don't know them to look at, they're strangers, but we're quite comfortable with them being there. And that for me seemed to be convivial and comfortable urbanism, and that's what we should be striving for. Yes, street. A lot of that streets with frontage and ownership and overlooking. Yes, the street and the neighbourhood were key concepts. So it's very heavily influential. And some people, when we go to communities, are familiar with it, and some aren't. I mean, Klaus got was it yesterday, got the Jane Jacobs Award was it in Bogota? Yeah, so that at one level, it's being discussed this way. We also have to take that thinking. And a large part of what I'm arguing is we've got to make it comfortable and approachable to anyone. I mean, I have had my mother come to some of our consultations, not necessarily agreeing what's being proposed by the council. And then she brings her friends and they all come and they give it. So we have to do things that we should be comfortable discussing with, as I used to say, my granny. She's got to feel comfortable with the terms and the approaches and the issues. She may not always agree with the outcome, but she's got to feel that the issues that people are concerned with are being discussed.
I was going to ask you, Kevin, about situations where there would be a lot of polarisation in an existing situation, and you're going in there as a private firm consultant working with the local authority, and the tension that would exist in the local authority between departments, between the engineering section, architects, planners. How do you deal with those kind of conflicts?
We try to get some neutral principles We don't always make them objectives because their objectives might be different. We try to get maybe little bits, if there's scope for some humour in there. There's a story that some of you may know, which we've done when we got to the end of the session. We said, look, there's a lady at the back raised an issue. She said, look, we're really worried about the pipeline. We had, we haven't, it hasn't come up. We asked the engineer, where is this? We should know about this. And we asked the planners, do you know? And we said, look, we don't know. Can you put it on the map for us? And she said, no, it's not this. He said, oh, you come down here from the council with your designers, and you just tell us it's all in the pipeline. And nothing ever happens. So we then got it, the team got it, and said, we can't keep having this consultation and nothing happens. We have to show what's happening. So that kind of, and that's a real story, but that story resonated in other places. I'm actually going to be working in Dickensie next week, where there is a bloody great pipeline, and I'm not sure that we can use that, Joe. This is a huge offshore pipeline coming into what was the power station. So the jokes work in certain places and they don't in others. But part of it is to help people relax and not be quite so adversarial. And sometimes those adversarial things are between neighbours and the view of something. And you've got to try and help them move beyond that. So we've got to try and be as respectful and neutral as we can, so that the opposition people, like the ones I showed in the picture, actually appreciate that we're going about it the right way. So we've got to be neutral, and when we go, we've got to help those people work together. So we're trying to set up those kinds of relationships.
Cities are developed by its people, hopefully by its people, for its people, for long term. The problem I have with short-termism, in any form of it, is that it misses a lot of things, potentially. And that is the challenge. How do we cover, for example, for somebody who has to work all hours and is unable to have a say in the process? How do we address the problems of people who are not able to articulate it in sessions with groups and others? How do we address the problems of the influence of the professionals, if you like, to provide the language with which people think? So, is it really that short-term event and people who are really drivers, or are we drivers? So these are all questions that I have, and I hope that we can talk about them. So in a sense, we have a model which is rigid, maybe long-standing, and not very efficient, and not very sensitive to the conditions of bureaucratic procedures and top-down. At the same time, we have the situations of short-term pop-up, charrette, coming for a short period and decide on long term. And all these things is innovative, energetic, interesting, but there are these two complete different positions, but there is a huge amount in the middle. Yeah, of course. The conversion is a lot of the time is what's happening. So the conversion of oversupply of office, for example, at some point was addressed by a permission to convert. And for example, now in the UK there's an oversupply of industrial space. In all of these industrial estates, there's oversupply of space, office space, or space. Of course, you can question the nature of the system that encourages this speculative development in areas that are not needed. Perhaps sometimes there's incentives for them to develop things in addition, but that's in the nature of the system. So, of course, there's got to be a way of addressing those excessive capacities, and the conversion to residential is an excellent idea.
I can recall in Dublin City Council, our finance department resisting temporary change of use because we were so reliant on rates as income, because residential property tax had been done away with years before. So there was a huge resistance to the formal change or even temporary change.
Different markets have different responses to temporariness because retail is much more flexible to these things, whereas residential and office are more difficult. So British government was much more flexible with retail, and so they some of these agents that are there's an organisation called Meanwhile Youth, Meanwhile, and they are a charity, and they are supported by the British government to come and facilitate this conversion of a supply of space, particularly in retail, to other purposes. But in residential, it's basically the temporary use is squatters, and nobody is happy with squatters, at least the official authorities. So there's a huge amount of squatting in Europe, for example. Rome, I saw the map of squatters in Rome. It's phenomenal, the number of buildings that are being squatted. Yes, so in a sense, squatters and then sort of bottom-up groups who get together and use places, they are a challenge to the system, to the established systems of rights and regulations and ownership. And now the question is, how does the system respond to that? Yeah. But also, what we need to realize is to avoid normalizing this condition of precarity. That we see it as normal, that some people have to do this sort of coming up and picking pieces from scraps from here and there. They deserve decent pathways in their lives, but a lot of young people don't have that. So they have to resort to these conditions. And then they are, if you like, presented as having been given opportunities, which is, but if you look at it from a more ideal situation, they should have much more secure pathways. There's a creative potential in structural disasters and situations of major structural change. But at the same time, there is precarity. That when everything settles, you see that precarity is normalized, or new pathways are open. So it's an interesting situation, but at the same time something that if you don't think creatively, you are dazzled by the colors and diversity of short-termism and not seeing the real conditions of some people underneath that, which is basically poverty and lack of opportunities.
I recall working on the SDZ for Docklands, and we were trying to generate three scales, the large, the medium and small. And then the small was the startup, the cultural element, but the other side of that cultural startup was the outfits that wanted to make a lot of money. But there was there was an outfit called Mavos down in Hanover Quay, and it was a pop-up art centre. It started from something called the Kings of Concrete. It was heavily into music. It ran all sorts of art and culture days for some of the big firms around there, and it's part of what you were talking about, I suppose, of that connecting with something edgy and branding and so on. But because of the private ownership of nearly all the property, and that's, say, the difference between the Dublin context and, say, Holland, we are trying to achieve loads of objectives through a private ownership situation. And it's extremely hard to factor in those cultural uses that maybe not profit-making, the developer has to forego. And sometimes the legislation does not even help us.
So the question is whether the system should become more flexible to allow this to happen. And if it does, what's gaining then, what's made loss? Well, it is happening everywhere. It is now normalized this process of artists using the opportunity that has been open for some reason, like Temple Bar here, planning light, a generation, spaces, good location, low rent. Artistic activities moving. Then this changes the image of the place, becomes bohemian, becomes attractive, becomes artistic, becomes cultural, and then everybody else moves in. The money is an investment, and the artists have to move out. Kreuzberg in Berlin, all of these neighborhoods that are, if you like, then now they are actively being used. That process that happened in Dublin a generation ago is not being accelerated in other places to say, how can we get, the example of Wembley that I mentioned is exactly that, a developer engineering that process of image changing and rebranding of an area that looked to be a bit dodgy and questionable, first to take this flavor of Bobo and then be preparing the ground for the property industry to come in. That is what's happening. Just yesterday we had a session in Newcastle, an old factory converted into artist spaces by a private organization and rented out to private creative types. And we used this facility, a space like this, for a conference yesterday. And there are developers, niche developers, working on this. There was a developer, another one that I remember, he was very innovative. That he developed a space in a very out of reach place in Newcastle, behind the central station that nobody had been able to regenerate. He was able to borrow sculptures from Paolozzi, who is a famous sculptor, to come and place it in front of this building and then use it to show how this building is good for artistic type. There are people who are working. Yeah.
Just my own question about, this local authority, top down, being a little bit uneasy with the challenge. Is there something approaching, a set of criteria or a charter anywhere? Has any city developed that, or is that killing that spontaneity, the idea of a charter?
Well, the idea of local authorities being responsive to the market, working with the market, is expressed in public-private partnerships and expressed in new public management and expressed in the way public authorities think about themselves as entrepreneurial. All of these things have been embedded now. So they really, even if you look at the plans are in a lot of cities are expressions of marketing rather than strategies for long-term transformation. There are broad keywords of wish and expectation rather than clear pathways to delivery of particular outcomes. So it's there. But this short-termism of temporary is even strong for that, even too much for that sort of mentality, because that mentality works on the basis of property and investment and reward. And that is challenged by some of these scenarios.
But what about the aspects of commercialization of the public realm and the retreat of the civic? You had slides with so many wonderful examples of the creative side of the thing, but the Coke bottle was probably interesting and provocative in that this branding of public space, is that a worry for you?
Absolutely. I hope that I expressed that worry somehow. If it hasn't come out, apologies. All of it was worry, in the sense that you see, for example, now big attractive projects like London Art was started as a temporary intervention for public enjoyment. But it takes part of the public space for that. Then it converted into a private property, sponsored and owned by private corporations and organizations. So in a sense, it's a process of privatizing. The Coke bottle is part of the city centre management, the business improvement districts initiatives. That they collect money from all the businesses to run the city effectively, to make it competitive with out-of-town shopping centres. But at the same time, they look at the city as a commercial opportunity. And they turn the city center space into places of exhibitions of this sort of thing, which is, in a sense, it's an earning opportunity, but it is changing the character of the place. So it is, of course, it is worrying. Not to the extent that it is the end of the world, but it is obviously downgrading of the quality of our public environment. The question is the balance between different forms of power. So if the political power is able to steer the course of money where it goes, and the political power is a democratic form of power, then of course then they are in charge. But if then the commercial and financial power is basically in charge, and they threaten that if you don't want us, we go somewhere else, and therefore political authority becomes a facilitator of investment and has to try to attract that. Therefore, the financial power has the upper hand and does things that have reward. And of course, some things, some public services, some poor people don't have any reward for anybody. And in that sense, it becomes problematic, highly problematic. So the balance between these two powers, or also suppliers, but if you think about it, the way you presented the question, ideally and democratically, the financial power has to be subordinate to the democratic political power of a people. But at the same time, with globalization, with floating investment patterns, all of these things, what you get is the inability to capture that or to control it. This is a question that, of course, if you want that money to work for you, you have to be able to develop that ability to rein it in. It's a big challenge to all governments everywhere, local and national. Well, us to enjoy is, of course, then what is us inclusive or us, the middle class professionals who enjoy going to restaurants and having fun. So in a sense, that's the question. That when there are these enjoyable places, this experience economy, this curating of experience is for people who can pay for it. Of course, it's fantastic. A lot of these improvements are fantastic. There's no question about that. Some of them are too corporate, too, if you like, distasteful in their aesthetics, in their qualities they create, in what they want to achieve. But ultimately, they may be better than a decline, the dilapidated scene of poverty. But the question is, in this change, who loses the game? And some people lose.
I think it's a small factor. I think there's too many other elements that are at play which bring the south and the north together in terms of process and planning and so on. I think you just look at the lines of light railway across the river, the bridges are connecting across, and so on. I think probably it's the lack of an adequate arena for conversation at the right level. It's just not happening between politicians, between the people who work for City Council, between the local communities. There's a highly polarised division in Dublin. We fall out very quickly, and what Kevin was talking about earlier on was something I thought quite ideal and highly resourced, and I think it comes back to the value system again. For example, there's no international city index of citizen engagement. The green index with metrics for this, that, and the other, but we've no international city index to say how cities, where they stand in the general area of collaborating and marshalling collective intelligence of everyone.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to close by thanking first our distinguished speakers and guests for offering excellent presentations that are dealing really with some of the fundamental questions that are both planning and design facing at this time. One is the issue of co-creation, co-design, and how we evolve in our practice with communities and places and people who live in the places that we're planning and designing. And the other is a huge, I think for me, the label was mismatch, and how we deal with this mismatch of supply and demand activities and spaces. And I think it's a huge question for planners, and different places, different countries, different societies and contexts would have a different mismatch. I would say actually the full spectrum, and which environments have more institutional tolerance to actually deal with this mismatch, and particularly with dealing with temporary. I think we are left with plenty of food for thought about all these issues, and I'd like to also to thank Dick about putting the Irish context in the context of Dublin and relating that context to the topics that we're presenting. So that's one. The other, I'd like to thank the audience for showing up in fantastic number and sharing, celebrating our anniversary with us, and more so than celebrating is really engaging in jointly thinking about the evolution of cities and places, the evolution of our approaches, how we intervene in these cities and places, and how we contribute to them becoming ineffective in a very effective way. So thank you all for coming and joining us, and I hope that you'll join us as well. I think we'll have equally stimulating and insightful discussion on November 30th with past, present, and future of planning. Thank you very much all for attending.